Visionary growers and farmers of the counterculture. Professor of History Theodore Roszak coined the term counterculture with his book The Making of a Counterculture, published in 1969. And right there in the book's subtitle, we have a clue as to the connection between the hippies and their love of what we might call biological agriculture. Reflections on the technocratic society and its youthful opposition. In delineating this antipathy towards a technocratic society, Roszak was referring to President Eisenhower's farewell address, broadcast on TV in January 1961, when he warned, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex." The useful concept of the counterculture drew together the various strands of youthful dissent which came to a head at the tail end of the 60s. This was famously characterized by such phenomenon and events as opposition to the Vietnam War and experimentation with psychedelics, by riots at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, and student protests in Paris, the Woodstock Festival, and cultural landmarks such as the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's album and the Whole Earth catalogue. Some commentators, such as Ken Goffman in Counterculture Through the Ages, have talked about a perennial counterculture, reaching back from the prophet Abraham. I prefer the starting point of Allen Ginsberg's reading Howl at the Sixth Gallery in San Francisco on October the 7th, 1955. The spirit of nonconformism bristled into the 70s, inspiring women's rights, sexual liberation, and New Age spirituality. Some critics point to the hip-hop culture of the early 1980s with its music, breakdancing and graffiti as a last hurrah. But there are ongoing processes that owe a tremendous debt to the counterculture. Recent histories, such as John Markoff's What the Dormouse Said and Joshua Clark Davis's From Head Shops to Whole Foods, have explored respectively the birth of personal computing and the growth of health foods against the backdrop of the movement. My own book, Retreat, looked at the raft of wellness modalities that emerged from the era with its transcendental meditation, macrobiotic diet, antipsychiatry, and LSD psychotherapy. This was an extraordinarily tumultuous time in society, and a beacon when it comes to contemplating the behaviour change that's necessary for us to adapt and survive in the coming years. Arguably, nowhere is this model for an alternative future more in evidence than in the counterculture's engagement with agriculture. My first encounter with farming in this context came through former Soil Association chairman Craig Sams, who I interviewed in 2018 about macrobiotic food, the hippie kosher diet. With his brother Greg, Sams had run the Seed macrobiotic restaurant in Ladbroke Grove, which had been a mecca for the likes of John Lennon and Yoko Ono. Together, they went on to sell locally grown organic produce through their company Whole Earth Foods. Discussing wellness with him, Sams referred to the health-giving properties of organic food. I was surprised by the illusion and vowed to investigate. It became apparent to me how the avowedly natural hippies, epitomised by Sams, had been drawn to the radical anti-industrial tenets of biodynamic and organic agriculture. Just as the hippies detested what Eisenhower had termed the military-industrial complex, so had Rudolf Steiner and Sir Albert Howard revolted against the reductionist science of chemical agriculture. A significant component of the countercultural opposition to these chemicals came from outrage at the Vietnam War. Dow and Monsanto, agricultural chemical manufacturers, acted under instruction from the US government to produce the herbicide Agent Orange to defoliate millions of acres of forest in Southeast Asia. However, the countercultural infatuation with agriculture was multifaceted. Rebelling against the state meant in many cases not simply growing food in the city, like early hippie organic advocate Jeannie Darlington, author of Grow Your Own, but heading back to the land. These back to the landers were serviced for tools and information by Stuart Brand's Whole Earth catalogue, and critically, both in the UK and USA looked to earlier pioneers for working models. Self-sufficiency advocates like John Seymour and the Nearings had an equivalent relationship to the back to the landers as that of the beatniks of the 50s to the hippies of the 60s and 70s. Their respective books, Living the Good Life and Self-Sufficiency, were closely studied and followed by the countercultural generation. But in both cases, these pioneers were initially sceptical of the hippies. Helen Nearing described the thousands of young people who visited them at their homestead in Maine. Never before in our lives have we met so many unattached, uncommitted, insecure, uncertain human beings. These stills, showing hippie visitors to the Nearing homestead in Maine, are from Bullfrog Films' 1977 documentary Living the Good Life. The same influx affected the original tiny spiritual community in Findhorn, which had become famous for having grown massive vegetables. In his autobiography, Findhorn's Peter Caddy noted that in 1968, "We were scarcely prepared for the next strange and exotic appearance and growth in the garden, however, the flower people." Caddy describes the phenomenon as the hippie invasion. Findhorn resident Cornelia Featherstone described to me how the hippies brought tremendous energy and growth to the community. "I think it was very much alive before then, but what it became was ferment in a much larger field. Before that it was very specific and quite esoteric in the true sense of the word, not seen. There was, as she puts it, something very dynamic about the Tweed and hippie conjunction in the 1970s. Across the Atlantic in Cape Cod, the New Alchemy Scientific Commune, affiliated with Findhorn, found of their early years that most of our visitors could have been loosely described as counterculture, usually youngish, longish hair, faded jeans, etc. But that later it became impossible to categorise, with numbers eventually reaching 10,000 a year. In the background here we can see the green machines, a biological way of purifying grey water developed by John Todd, the director at New Alchemy. However, in time, even the Nearings and John Seymour came to appreciate the hippie sincerity in these matters. The evidence of their dedication can be found as early as this photo in the Whole Earth catalogue, captioned "Transplanting Cabbage Seedlings in Chadwick's Incredible Biodynamic Garden at UC Santa Cruz. The main reason a lot of longhairs are attending the school." Or as recently in the staggering library of the pioneer Eliot Coleman, a self-professed hippie. In some cases, the hippies took self-sufficiency to unheard-of peaks. At its height, Tennessee's mega-commune The Farm, Michael Gorman describes how, having only taken one class in organic farming in 1969 and, despite my youth and relative inexperience, I ended up in charge of growing the community's food. On the back of that one class, O'Gorman ran agriculture at the farm for much of his 11 years there, providing at its peak 90% of the community's food for a population which reached 1,500 people on their 1,000 cultivated acres. Vegans, the farm grew soybeans, peanuts and a wide variety of legumes. They raised corn, wheat, oats, barley, rye and buckwheat. There were fresh summer vegetables like sweet corn, onions, tomatoes, peppers, aubergine and cucumbers, regional varieties like okra, crookneck squash and butter beans, and cool weather crops like cabbage, collards, turnip greens and kale. They also grew potatoes and sweet potatoes, which were good enough to be certified seed stock and were sold thus. Every available of organic matter, manure from the horses' stables, the waste from local cotton manufacturing, and spent hay from the fields was collected. and all the farm's food waste was composted. Here some of the farming crew are pictured with their unfeasibly large sorghum crop, which they made into syrup. Of their sorghum experiment, O'Gorman writes, "We got together with the neighbours and planted a total of 140 acres of cane. We really didn't have any notion of how big 140 acres was, but when we'd tell old-timers how much we had growing, they'd usually have a fit laughing or just shake their heads amazed." Here's the farm's book, Hey Beatnik, the most famous of their many publications. The counterculture's engagement with growing food was, to a dizzying extent, philosophical. Before the multiple channels with which we now stay informed, books like Tompkins and Bird's The Secret Life of Plants and Rachel Carson's devastating critique of the overuse of DDT, Silent Spring, were critical. Many of that generation arrived at the ideas of farming as a result of experiences with psychedelics. Joni Mitchell, the folk rocker who railed against DDT in her song Big Yellow Taxi, said of LSD, "I think that afforded people a view of nature, those who survived it, and there were some casualties. Certainly I would be surprised that people who took it, even if they were urban born, did not come away from it with some kind of ecological feeling." Beatnik poet Gary Snyder also reflected, "Peyote and acid have a curious way of tuning some people into the local soil." Snyder, who with Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs was one of the original beatniks, starred in Jack Kerouac's book The Dharma Bums as Jaffe Ryder. Here he is at the Human Being, a celebrated gathering in San Francisco in 1967 with Allen Ginsberg. Snyder grew up on a homestead and went back to the land in 1969. Contacting Snyder, now 95, by email, early on in its gestation, I explained that with this book, The Garden, I was trying to establish a connection between growing, farming, and the broader continuum of culture. Snyder replied that, "I think my problem with your approach is that I never think of agriculture or gardens except in the light of wild and natural process." By this statement, Snyder refers to the idea he expresses in his book The Practice of the Wild, where he outlines his view that gardening and growing, when done properly, are not processes through which nature is civilized, but ones in which the gardener or grower participates in the wild. Connected to these experiences were the stirrings of what Theodore Roszak termed eco-psychology. Alienation from the land was understood as a cause of mental illness. This is a photo I took of the garden at the Esalen Institute in California in 2018. Esalen was where these ideas were worked out in conferences led by Roszak and founder of Esalen's Hot Springs Farm, Stephen Harper. Agricultural philosopher Wendell Berry, Gary Snyder's close friend and a fellow traveller of the countercultures, went further still, claiming, "Our society's ignorance of farming lies at the root of systemic racism." But the hippies did not just reheat the radical ideas of the 30s. On his own version of the hippie trail, shadowing Gary Snyder as he travelled around Japan, the hippie Larry Korn found and brought Masanobu Fukuoka to the world's attention. Korn explains of his importation of Fukuoka's ideas to America. The One Straw Revolution was published in 1975 in Japan, titled Shizen no Wara Ippon no Kakume, and had little immediate impact in Japan. However, when it was translated into English, it became a sensation. This countercultural receptivity to non-Western ideas was also key to the farm's Albert Bates and Craig Sam's promotion of biochar, which first came to prominence owing to Charles Mann's historical exhumation of terra preta, the black earth of the Amazon basin. Likewise, hippie permaculture co-originator David Holmgren, with his colleague Bill Mollison, learnt from Aboriginal farming techniques. With permaculture, they conceived of a system of agricultural design, harmonizing efficiencies, which has become the de facto alternative form of farming across the world. Holmgren, who I interviewed for the book, had this to say about the counterculture in his book, Permaculture Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability. Never in human history has there been such a great need and opportunity for cultural and intellectual renewal from the margin. The countercultural movement of the late 1960s and early 70s is perhaps the most dynamic cultural example of the value of marginal systems in social transition. The counterculture, understood and denigrated in the cultural mainstream as a failure characterized by naive and silly ideas, has been a major source of innovation. I see permaculture and the counterculture within a longer tradition of alternative movements within modernity, which have the potential to spark the transformation of civilization necessary for inevitable energy descent. Indeed, the counterculture's presence can be felt acutely in today's alternative agricultural landscape. The UK's innovator Patrick Holden, who went back to the land in this era, works with the Sustainable Food Trust on cutting-edge solutions like the Global Farm Metric to regulate the exploding sustainable agriculture sector. America's Real Organic Project, another product of the countercultural generation, has vigorously challenged the erosion of the organic standard in the USA, as hydroponics and confined animal feeding operations have controversially acquired organic status. Running through the entire history is the influence of India and Eastern philosophy. From Sir Halbert Alward's creation of the indoor method, learning from farmers in the subcontinent, of which he commented, "I decided that I could not do better than watch the operations of these peasants and acquire their traditional knowledge as rapidly as possible," to self-sufficiency guru John Seymour's extensive travels in India in the 50s, to E.F. Schumacher's idea of Buddhist economics. In this era, many enterprising gurus like Krishnamurti, Mahesh Maharishi Yogi, and the Hare Krishna leader Prabhupada brought ideas of holism from Eastern philosophy to the West. This is a photo of the Hare Krishna Swami himself, a reconstruction of him at his desk, which I took when I visited the Hare Krishna HQ at Bhaktivedanta Manor. The Hare Krishna method of dairy farming has taken a foothold in the UK at Bhaktivedanta Manor. This is largely the work of pioneering dairy farmer and former high priest Stuart Coyle. Their work in sparing male calves has influenced the foundation of the highly successful Ahimsa dairy. The Hare Krishnas, of whom there is perhaps undue suspicion, were tirelessly championed by Beatle George Harrison. However, the Beatle we most associate with farming is Paul McCartney. The hippies have had an influence on agriculture totally out of proportion to their numbers, but their endeavours weren't always successful. As Wendell Berry, an experienced farmer, put it, "I think the popular drug culture and certain aspects of the peace and environment movements have led people to believe there's a great deal you can do with enthusiasm. I have a lot of enthusiasm, but I know how far it will get me. It doesn't last until dark when you've got a full day's work or 3 or 4 days' work to do in a day." The movement was especially the victim of the plummeting value of food. In 1910, food made up 40% of a person's expenditure, and the previous generation of American back-to-the-landers would find growing their own food would save them a lot of money. However, by 1970, the most back-to-the-landers could count on saving was 10 to 15%, added to which things which had not previously been a factor became costly: land prices, taxes, and medical costs. Nevertheless, pioneers who survived these challenges became stronger and wiser, still unconventional voices, and in a surprisingly high number of cases, turned into leading figures in today's agriculture. Thank you.